Hi, my name is Dr. Jonathan Bonenwetham, and I'm going to present a paper today titled Authenticity as Vulnerability, the Risk of Being. So just to start, I want us to imagine that we're in a cave. It's very dark with the distant sound of trickling water. The walls, what you can see of them, are rough grey rock. There is light streaming in through the entrance way that you've walked through. And as you walk further into the cave, you see the silhouettes of people sat in a row on a bench with their backs to you. From a vantage point, you see that they are in some kind of restraints, positioned in such a way that they cannot see anything but that which is in front of them. This is a massive wall of rock, but what is singular about it is that the shadows appear on it, darkened facsimiles of the people and animals passing by outside the cave mouth. This cave is a creation of Plato, the well-known Greek philosopher who used it as an analogy of how we see reality and its true nature. He said that we don't know how these cave dwellers got there or for how long they've been in the cave, but what we do know is that the shadows that appear on the cave wall are what amounts to reality for those cave dwellers. Their chains allow them no other way of seeing the world. One day, however, one of the cave dwellers finds themselves freed of her chains. She is able to get off the bench and look around. As she turns, the light shining from the cave mouth dazzles her at first, used as she is to the darkness. Her eyes slowly adjust as she tentatively walks through the cave, with its slight incline up to the entrance of the cave mouth itself. The brilliance of this new world dims a little as her eyes begin to take in the forms that are new to her, but also reminiscent of what, though she can't quite immediately put her finger on. It takes a little time for the penny to drop, but she soon realises that the outlines in this world bear striking similarities to the darkened shapes that appear on her cave wall, way back underground. This revelation leaves her reeling. Her whole world has been turned upside down, literally seeing it in a different light. When she recovers a little, she thinks of her people back down in the darkness of the cave, watching a poor replica of reality. She turns and runs carefully down into the cave, this old world showing itself for what it is, a prison, having kept her from the truth of things for so long. When she reaches the other cave dwellers, her heart is pounding with the revelation, adrenaline coursing throughout her body, so much so that she has to take a few deep breaths before she can talk to them. Time passes. With what started as enthusiastic evangelizing slowly becomes pained pleading. The others' faces range from concern, sadness, and indifference, all the way to barely contained fury. Not a single one of them believes her, and eventually they shut off their ears to her altogether. Her freedom has closed off one world as the other one shows itself and opens up a new reality to her. But she becomes outcast because of her enlightenment, the risk she took in both taking up the possibility of a different reality and trying to communicate that new world to others. And it is this idea of risk and what I'll term authenticity that particularly interests me here. It is that interplay, what might be taking place within this case, what may be taking place within the cave, and how it relates to our world. That is what I want to get across in this talk. Authenticity itself is a key existentialist term, and from the German Identität, it can perhaps be better translated as ownedness. The term threads through, whether from thinkers like Heidegger and Nietzsche through to Heidegger, Sartre and Beauvoir, and is always something that is in juxtaposition to others in some way. That is other people. For Sartre, this relationship with other people is summed up in his play Huis Clos, where hell is, he said, other people. These others did not take ownership of their existence for him, and instead flee from the contingency and uncertainty of bare life and the weight that they can choose their existence if they wish. If they wish. The decision for how one lives is not down to someone else or another authority like the church. It is for them to decide. But this also means they must take responsibility for their lives. For Heidegger, another philosopher in the 20th century who influenced Sartre and company, this weight of what he would call authenticity is equally at odds with other people and others. But he defines it further through what he calls das Man, or the they or the one. So it's a neuter term in German. This is where everyone does things because that is the way everyone else does it. What he discloses here is in part a necessary element of social intelligibility, but it is also a negative phenomenon which is a kind of social construction, where instead of taking up one's existence, people throw themselves into a world lacking true individuation, almost seeming to flee from themselves to be just like everyone else. Why, though? Well, for Heidegger, Das Man provides a wonderful hiding place where you can flee from your own self. But why would you want to flee? Well, precisely because to face oneself is actually to face one's finitude, which is to say simply that one is mortal. That we are finite creatures is a core part of existence for Heidegger. And by facing our vulnerability, we also realise the vulnerable state of everything else. Our norms and values are contingent and are far from complete and set. When this happens, this authentic revelation about the nature of existence, our sense of reality comes undone, and the authentic person must somehow act within the world with this knowledge. This could easily be seen as a way of being that is denuded of meaning, a nihilistic sensibility. But on the contrary, for Heidegger, there is a richer intelligibility here, and consequently a sensibility that enables a creative engagement with the world and with others. Perhaps a way of looking at this is to say that you are no longer painting with a dot-to-dot kit, but rather the canvas is blank and the colours are there. A certain avant-gardism, perhaps. But for Heidegger, like Plato, such an authentic way of being is far, far from easy, and one's creative approaches that might show an alternative way to others can quickly become shut off and the risk that one has taken, denuded of its true agency and impact within the world. And it's this that I want to look at further by giving a real-life example, and then hoping that a further two philosophers can help draw out what is perhaps happening here. In July 2017, a rather sad and odd thing happened, and one that is also in keeping with the talk here. The 53-year-old French philosopher and psychoanalyst Anne Dufourmentel was on a beach in Saint-Tropez with her daughter. In the surf, two children, strangers to her, suddenly got caught up in a riptide, dragging them away further and further from the beach. She didn't hesitate. She ran across the sand and dived into the surf, swimming hard to get to the struggling children. During the rescue, though, her heart gave out. And whilst the children were ultimately saved, Anne Dufourmentel was pulled from the sea, with attempts to resuscitate her having failed. This is a tragic story and was picked up by a broad range of media from Le Monde Libération, The Guardian, Times, Telegraph, New York Times, etc. Which in itself is odd considering that she was not a well-known philosopher outside of France. But it was with a certain irony that they were drawn to her story. Which is to say, she was a philosopher of risk who died according to her own inner demand. To risk is to truly live, she thought. In an interview, she once said that when one admits his fear, his finitude, his confidence can be reborn from this vulnerability. Being alive is a risk few beings are. So being alive is a risk. Few beings are. To risk one's life, a well-used phrase, carries here a far deeper meaning. It is not just a moment, an event where one takes a decision to act in such a way as to potentially jeopardise one's life. It is more. It is a laying oneself open without the security of certainty and pre-given meaning. But this philosopher of risk, and the end of her story was reported everywhere. I think it had both a fascination for the media, the perfect alignment of ideals and practice, but also a certain disempowering and anaesthetising quality. Like I did above in my introduction, the reporters too curated a story. In doing so, the information about what happened got spread across the globe instantly, copies and copies of circumstances appearing everywhere. Something seen so many times perhaps takes away its impact. Perhaps position here in some kind of commentary from beyond. The issue for Dufourmentel is that instead of living in an age of risk, as would perhaps at first seem to be the case, with a global pandemic, acts of terrorism, refugees and financial crises, we actually live in an incredible age of security. Dufourmentel says that there is a vicious circle at work here. Acts of violence and fear create new and greater forms of security, which themselves disturb things and also create a sense of insecurity, which can create more violence, and on and on. This said, we know from Heidegger that this need for security has a deeper cause, though, and one that Dufourmentel gives a more psychoanalytic answer to. As soon as we take our first breath when we were born, we are fundamentally vulnerable. This is a radical passage into the world, into a new world, and one that is uncanny and possibly dangerous. This is something that can stay with us well into our adult lives, repressed deep, deep down. And when a threat of fear occurs, part of us returns to this first stage, instead of the possibility of creative birth, a certain privileging of natality perhaps. This shows a negative pathology focused on ends and demise. This very much seems to reflect a kind of fleeing from our existence that Heidegger identifies, where we can hide from our vulnerability in with everyone else, perhaps be anyone other than ourselves, just in amongst the shadows on the wall, a dream a part of and apart from the world. Over the last decade, and perhaps even more so over the last 18 months, it feels very much like a dream at times. Shadows playing on the wall, although some might go so far as to say that's putting things too mildly. Nightmarish is perhaps more apt. Nevertheless, there is a certain unreality about the world at times, and in this last part of my talk I want to bring in two people who can help us with deciding if this dreamlike state is just a figment of my imagination or whether it is indicative of something else. Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean Baudrillard. Welcome. Firstly, I want to introduce Nietzsche's work on Greek tragedy and his concept of nihilism. Indeed, Greek tragedy is perhaps actually crucial for understanding the rest of Nietzsche's thought, so a worthwhile mine of information to understand the rest of his work. But Greek tragedy reached its apex in the work of the great tragedians like Sophocles, who wrote Oedipus Rex and Antigone. It had two aspects that were crucial to its power, and these were represented by two gods, Apollo and Dionysius. Apollo represents rationality and order, but also illusion and fantasy. The dramatic portrayal of myths of heroes, gods, and monsters was a way of mitigating the horrors of suffering in everyday life, a means of projecting fears and pain onto representations of the world that were far enough away and yet still familiar enough to be meaningful and relevant. The Apollonian was a salve, perhaps in the same way that EastEnders or Handmaid's Tale are. They take us away for a time, and all the suffering is played out by others on the screen. The Dionysian, conversely, is rather more chaotic, characterised by emotion and ecstasy, as well as intoxication and dance. And these can equally be said to be a way to escape the everyday. In the Greek plays, especially by Sophocles, the Dionysian was in part embodied in the chorus, through whose songs the audience are able to feel more a part of the performance itself, all the more drawn in with others like them, who are not gods or heroes, just everyday folk, like you and I. In the same way that a certain amount of booze can perhaps elicit a certain togetherness or camaraderie with others that wouldn't usually happen in John Lewis, the chorus breaks down our individual barriers. Thus, for the Greek tragedies, the balance between the two forces created both a salve through narrative structure and imagination, as well as a common bond with others, a kind of opening up to the world. So how does this help us think through everything we've been looking at? For Nietzsche, these aspects were also present in everyday life as well. Kept in balance, I think both Apollo and Dionysius are positive forces, like in the tragedies. And any good play or film has a certain fantasy quality to it, follows an ordered narrative and logical progression, but also has emotion and passion, with bonds created either with characters or with those you're watching with. In short, it opens up new worlds. However, I want to argue that things are very much out of balance in the world. The current age, I'd suggest, is defined by a kind of extreme Apollonian quality, which perhaps has helped denude the world of the impact of events like Dufourmentel's act of risk and death. Reality and fantasy are no longer clearly defined, and Nietzsche would say that this is indicative of us of escaping from facing up to the suffering in the world, and also one's ability to joyfully take hold of one's own possibilities in the face of all this. No small task, and this is echoed in Heidegger. This is why the Dionysian is so important. Like with various forms of intoxication, the Dionysian is indicative of a kind of ecstatic experience whereby the world is opened up to us. It reveals it as it is. Without the complete and unbalanced sedative force of Apollo, it puts us outside of ourselves. And by this I mean outside of our everyday homogenised perceptions. A kind of ecstatic state of being. We can choose whether to hide in absolute fantasy or take hold of new possibilities, and with a balanced Apollonian element perhaps, create the self in the face of chaos. This means facing the chaos, though, and a world that is contingent, and it's no small feat. Prior to Heidegger, Nietzsche defined this form of chaos as nihilism. Simply put, we have previously taken to be the markers of certainty, that is to say, authorities providing absolute certainty and meaning, no longer hold sway. Nihilism is something that Nietzsche proclaims in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. When the man cries out, God is dead, the question now is whether one faces it or flees, returning into the they or the herd. So contrary to what a lot of people think about Nietzsche, he was not a champion of nihilism, and it's perhaps more helpful to see him instead as a physician of existence, diagnosing what ails the world. What the death of God means for Nietzsche is the death of absolute objective authority, whether this be moral, religious, legislative, or political, for example. The Dionysian discloses the relativeness of these big fantastical stories that provide meaning, whether they be Christianity, Marxism, Steve Jobsism, or Trumpianity, etc. And this is also an important part of what is called postmodernism. Being incredibly reductionist, postmodernism has similarities across all disciplines, and is usually refers to belief around the contingent nature of so-called truths and socially conditioned knowledge claims and values. Like modernism, it was reacting against previous forms and ideas. And here you'll be forgiven if you think that some postmodern theories bear more of a resemblance to teenage rebellion kicking against the bricks. Anyway, there is an inherent suspicion of claims to certainty and towards what different theorists have termed grand or meta-narratives. Essentially the big stories that provide certainty and meaning. So there's a certain similarity here with what we find in nihilism. Of the many different postmodern philosophers and theorists like Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Lyotard, it is Jean-Luc Baudrillard who is the most important for us in looking at what ails us, as he is both a philosopher and a sociologist. What is important for us are two of his terms, simulacrum and hyperreality. The first term he actually takes from Plato. For our ancient Greek friend, there are two forms of images, accurate representation and a simulacrum. The latter is one that is a distorted image to seem more real to the viewers. This distorted version is actually a kind of sophistry, an argument that is more concerned with looking and sounding right than actually accessing any truth. Sophistry for Plato is a simulacrum of true knowledge, and perhaps you start to see why I'm bringing this in here. It both takes us back to the cave and the shadows on the wall, but also the simulacrum being as a distortion and barrier to truth is particularly apt here. Baudrillard would, I think, agree, and takes Plato's idea further and applies it to the modern age. He says that we live in a world of simulation like never before, one more sophisticated than the one set up for the cave dwellers, certainly. It is one where images and information inundate us every day and every hour. Reality is represented through news and advertising and thoroughly intrudes on all aspects of our lives. Information is in constant flow, at times at least online. It is tailored to the beliefs and points of view we already hold, solidifying them even more. News programmes are interspersed amongst the spectacle of reality, TV and adverts. They curate reportage, reconstructing the story for the audience, creating another type of spectacle for a distant viewer, one that is meant to be a true representation of reality. Is this curated stream representing reality meaningful? Or is it just a flow of information and images, going no deeper than an attention-grabbing headline? For Baudrillard, this flow of image and information does more than simply represent reality, though. And this begins to sound a bit like the film The Matrix, which if you haven't seen, you need to. To understand this, Baudrillard says that there are 4 stages of representation. And bear with me with this. The first 2 are stages that are, respectively, one that is a reflection of a profound reality, and another one that masks and denatures a profound reality. The cave in Plato's allegory would come under this second stage. The shadows on the wall took away the true reality from the cave dwellers, whose own denatured reality was a series of dark projections upon the wall. There are 2 other stages that go beyond these. One that masks the absence of a profound reality, and lastly, one that has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. Still with me? So with the first 2, there is another world, so to speak, one higher and more meaningful. Whereas for the last 2, meaning seems to have disappeared altogether. Now I appreciate this is a tad painful to get one's head around. Postmodern thinkers aren't known for their simplicity and clarity of thought, and sometimes you just, well, want to shake them a lot. But to put things simply though, for the stage where it masks the absence of profound reality, there is reference to there once having been a profound reality of some kind. In the last stage, however, people experience a simulated sense of reality rather than reality itself, and also have no concern with this disconnection with the more profound reality, and that's the important distinction. In this, there is a deluge of copies of copies. People experience a hyper-reality, where the original is now completely absent. So this stage is kind of like someone capturing a play of shadows on the wall of a cave, and then reproducing them so many times that the original forms that cast the shadows in the first place are just lost. Just shadows creating shadows, creating shadows. There is therefore nowhere else to go for anyone who finds himself freed from their chains. No light leading them to a true reality, and even worse, perhaps for Baudrillard, that freed slave just doesn't care. There is no drive towards the other reality. A way that makes sense to me is to think of it like a constant stream of Gogglebox, but with us watching people watching Gogglebox, without there being any other content. That is to say, the original programme that was being watched. And I think this actually sums it up in a nutshell, no matter how mind-warping that might be. But to bring us back to Nietzsche, this to me is a kind of extreme hyper-Apollonianism, or Apollo on some serious steroids, Perhaps more appropriately, some serious antidepressants, ones numbing us completely, as all this sounds incredibly depressing. For me, though, this tends towards an explanation of the dreamlike quality that the world seems to have at times. But I don't think, though, that we live in quite the extreme hyper-reality that Baudrillard suggests, albeit one that does at times seem to be close to it, admittedly. I do think that we exist closest to perhaps the third stage, that is to say, the one masking the fact that there is a lack of a profound reality. But there's an important distinction here. This lack is not actually a lack of a profound or meaningful reality as such, but it is rather a lack of profound reality and meaning created by others. And I want to emphasise this created by others aspect. We know that Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, and for those so used to the big stories that we mentioned, that make up reality per se, and which are essentially created and continued by others, whether they be moral, religious, legislative or political, there is no meaningful reality in that sense. But this is quite different from saying there is no meaningful reality whatsoever. And existentialists like Nietzsche and Heidegger would want to point out that we actually have absolute freedom, which is dizzying, nausea-inducing even. But this means that we have the ability to choose our own possibilities, to take ownership of them, and create meaning from those decisions, not let others do it for us. But to many, it is admittedly terrifying. It is what Dionysius embodies, and because of this, is it not better to cling to the comfort of illusion? The irony is that in this technologised global age, we have more possibilities and choices than ever in the history of the world, and thus the ability to create meaning more so than ever, and yet it enables us to hide from this fact so absolutely, totally. This, I think, fits in nicely with everything we have said. Overcoming this involves recognising where this need for security comes from, or perhaps certainty. And then life can take on a richer meaning, a riskier one certainly, a little more Dionysian, perhaps, but one faced with our eyes open, making our own choices and creating a meaningful existence, one that existentialist philosophers would call living an authentic life, and what Dufour-Montel would call, most definitely, living riskily. Thank you.